History isn't always written in ink. Sometimes it is written in blood carved into memory by grief. This is the story of the Trail of Tears, not just a road, but a scar across the heart of a people. For thousands of years, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations lived in the lands of the American South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. They built towns, created constitutions, schools, and even newspapers. Some had European-style homes, others still lived traditionally, but all shared one bond: the sacredness of their land. To them, the earth was not property. It was their grandmother. Every river had a spirit, every tree a story, every hill a burial ground. But to the American government and settlers driven by greed, this land meant gold, cotton, and expansion, and nothing, not even human lives, would stand in the way. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a law that would begin the forced relocation of native tribes to lands west of the Mississippi River. It was painted as voluntary, but the reality was different. Treaties were signed under pressure, others were faked, and leaders were threatened or killed. The Cherokee resisted through the courts. In 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court even ruled in their favor, but Jackson infamously dismissed the decision, saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." This marked the beginning of a tragedy. Families were torn from their homes with guns at their backs. Women cried, children screamed, and elders clutched the earth. They were about to leave, and knowing they might never see it again. Thousands were herded like cattle into overcrowded camps, waiting to be escorted westward. They would soon embark on a journey of over 1,000 miles, a journey that would bury many of them along the way. A journey history now remembers as the Trail of Tears. They called it removal, but for the native tribes it was exile. It was death in slow motion. The camps were the beginning of the end. Cramped, dirty, and surrounded by soldiers, the Cherokee and other tribes were held like prisoners. Many died before the journey even began. There was not enough food, no clean water, and illness spread like wildfire. Mothers held dying infants in their arms while prayers rose into the sky, unanswered. Then came the march. In the fall and winter of 1838, under the cold eyes of armed soldiers, nearly 16,000 Cherokees began a forced journey of over 1,000 miles to what is now Oklahoma. They walked through mountains, forests, rivers, and snow with no wagons for most, and little more than rags for warmth. The government had promised supplies, but what they gave was nothing more than neglect. Many wore no shoes. Their feet froze and bled. The elderly collapsed on the road, too weak to take another step. Some children, sick and starving, died in their mother's arms and their tiny bodies, buried in shallow graves along the path, with stones for headstones if they were lucky. Each morning the march resumed. Each night another soul was lost. Snow turned red with blood. One survivor later wrote, "I saw women give birth on the side of the road, and 2 hours later, they were forced to walk again. I saw children cry themselves to death." The soldiers had orders to keep moving. Compassion was not part of the mission. Those who slowed down were whipped, shouted at, or left behind to die. Some tried to escape into the woods, but most were hunted down. They were not seen as human. They were seen as obstacles to progress. And yet through all this, the people sang. They whispered prayers. They held each other, because even as their bodies broke, their spirits refused to die. By the time they reached the Indian Territory, more than 4,000 Cherokee men, women and children were dead, nearly 1 in 4. This was not just a migration. It was a death march. And the trail they left behind was not one of footprints. It was a trail soaked in tears, in blood, in silence. The Trail of Tears was not an accident of history. It was not a mistake. It was a calculated act of greed built on lies and driven by power and profit. In the late 1820s, gold was discovered in Cherokee land in Georgia. The Georgia Gold Rush brought thousands of white settlers flooding into the region, but instead of respecting Cherokee sovereignty, the U.S. government looked the other way and then helped take the land. Despite the fact that the Cherokee had adopted many white customs, farming, Christianity, even slavery, they were still seen as less than. They built schools, developed a written language, even had a Cherokee Nation constitution. They hoped assimilation would protect them. It didn't. President Andrew Jackson claimed removal was for their own good. He said they would thrive in the West. But he also owned land and slaves, and saw native lands as economic opportunity. His real motive? Expansion, profit, white domination. Even the courts failed to protect the tribes. When the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee in Worcester, Georgia, 1832, Jackson simply ignored it. Let them enforce it, he sneered. In that moment, the law bowed to power. Many so-called treaties used to justify removal were signed by a handful of tribal members, without the consent of their people. In the case of the Cherokee, the Treaty of New Echota, 1835, was signed by a minority and denounced by 90% of the tribe. Yet it was enforced as law. It was legalized theft. Soldiers stormed villages, pulled families from their homes, looted their belongings. Churches burned. Cemeteries were abandoned. Generations of heritage wiped away overnight. The message was clear. You are not American. You are in the way. Children were separated from parents. Sacred sites were bulldozed. Fields once planted with corn were trampled by boots. The spiritual world of the native peoples, where everything was alive and connected, was shattered by the cold machinery of colonization. And yet the government called it progress. But at what cost? A nation built on freedom had stolen it from others. A republic that preached liberty had ripped it away from those who could not fight back. And the trail of tears became a stain that no flag could ever wash away. Time passes, but wounds do not always heal. For the descendants of those who walked the trail of tears, the pain is not just a chapter in history. It is a quiet echo that lives in blood, in name, in silence. Many Americans today do not know this story. It is rarely taught in schools. It is softened in textbooks if mentioned at all. Words like relocation or resettlement hide the reality of what it truly was. A forced death march, a cultural genocide. The United States government has never formally apologized for the Trail of Tears. There have been acknowledgments, yes, memorials, history markers, and speeches, but no real justice, no full recognition of what was stolen. Not just land, but life, language, and legacy. Some tribes, like the Cherokee Nation, continue to fight for their stories to be told truthfully. They've built museums, cultural centers, and language programs, not to forget but to remember on their own terms. Every year, Native youth retrace the Trail of Tears on foot, honoring their ancestors by walking the same path of sorrow, not as victims but as survivors. But still the wound remains. When Native communities demand respect for sacred lands today, they are often ignored. When they speak of historical trauma, they are told to move on. But how do you move on when your ancestors were buried in unmarked graves by a government that still refuses to say their names? The Trail of Tears is not just about the Cherokee. It is about every indigenous nation that was erased, moved, broken, and betrayed. It is about colonization and how it operates not just with guns, but with laws and lies and silence. It is about how a nation built its wealth on the bones of those it deemed less worthy. And it is about memory. Because if we forget what happened, we allow it to happen again. They tried to erase them, tried to silence their songs, burn their languages, bury their stories. But they failed. Because despite the death, the marches, the cold, and hunger, the native people survived. And not just survived, they endured, resisted, rebuilt. Today, the descendants of those who walked the Trail of Tears live across the world. Some live in cities, some still live in tribal lands, but all carry something that can't be taken. The spirit of their ancestors. They carry stories passed down by whispered firelight. They sing in languages once banned. They fight for sacred lands, water, and recognition. And though history tried to write them out, they write themselves back in, louder than ever. The Trail of Tears is not just a memory, it is a thread, woven into every native voice that refuses to be silent, every native child that learns their mother tongue, every elder that tells the truth even when the world turns away. This is not just history, this is now. To the governments that broke promises, they remember. To the systems that tried to crush them, they resist. To the world that forgot them, and they speak. We are still here, they say. We have always been here. And to you and the viewer, the listener, you have a choice. You can turn away, scroll past, forget, or you can carry this story forward, because history is not just in books, it lives in voices, in truth, in remembrance. Let the Trail of Tears remind us that silence can kill, but remembering can heal. Telling the truth can change what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us remember, no people will ever have to walk a trail like that again. This is the end of the story, but not the end of the truth.